The ferry, a squat, rust-streaked vessel named the Solace, cleaved the gray-green water with a sigh. Dean stood at the bow, the biting spray doing little to sting away the dull ache behind his eyes. He watched the mainland shrink, its clustered lights blurring into a faint smear against the bruised horizon. Each receding mile was a physical severing, a deliberate excision of the life he'd known, the life that had been irrevocably shattered. He'd packed little, mostly maps and surveying equipment, as if charting new territories could somehow redraw the landscape of his own grief. The air, sharp with brine and something else, a primordial dampness that clung to the throat promised only more isolation. His destination, a remote island known only as Blackwater, was a jagged silhouette against the perpetually overcast sky. It was a place of last resorts, a forgotten scrap of land his estranged grandfather had called home until his quiet passing. Dean had inherited the lighthouse keeper's cottage, a relic of a bygone era, along with the unsettling silence of a family history he'd never truly known. He sought not answers, but an end to the ceaseless noise in his own head. The ferry shuddered as it approached the island's single rickety dock. A narrow ramp clanked down, and the few passengers, mostly weather-beaten fishermen and a taciturn supply clerk, disembarked. Dean followed, his heavy duffel bag slung over his shoulder, the weight of it a familiar anchor. A small, salt-blasted shack stood a short distance from the dock, marked with a peeling hand-painted sign. Border Checkpoint. A stocky, stoic guard in a thick wool coat emerged, his face a roadmap of windburn and skepticism. He didn't smile. Name? The guard grunted, his voice gravelly, his gaze sweeping over Dean with an almost invasive thoroughness. He held a clipboard, its paper curled and yellowed. Dean Miller. The guard squinted at the manifest, his finger tracing a line down the page. Miller, grandson of the old keeper, eh? Heard he finally went to ground. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the guard's hand as he gestured towards a small, smudged map tacked to the shack's interior wall. You're off the grid here, son. No easy way back once the storms roll in. His eyes, the color of sea ice, held a strange, knowing glint before he waved Dean through. Just the cottage and the tower up there. Don't go wandering off the paths, not after dark. The warning, delivered with a flat, emotionless tone, settled in Dean's stomach like a cold stone. He nodded, then began the arduous trek up the winding, unpaved track that snaked towards the island's highest point. The air grew colder, heavier as he ascended. The fog, a dense, swirling shroud, began to descend, swallowing the dock and the ferry whole. The cottage materialized from the fog like a ghost. It was a squat, stone structure, its walls encrusted with lichen and salt, its windows like vacant eyes. Perched precariously on the cliff edge beside it, the lighthouse tower rose, a stark, skeletal finger against the vaporous sky. The beacon, unlit, was a blind sentinel. This was not merely solitude, it was an exile. He pushed open the heavy, creaking door. The interior was a tomb of stale air and forgotten things. The scent of damp stone, dust, and something else. Something metallic and faintly acrid, like old pennies left in stagnant water, filled his nostrils. Light, what little there was, filtered through grimy windows, painting weak rectangles on the floorboards. His grandfather's life was preserved in amber here. Stacks of yellowed nautical charts, their edges frayed, rolled tight with twine. A telescope mounted on a tripod, its brass tarnished. A collection of worn, leather-bound books on maritime history and local legends, their pages brittle. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light like tiny, frantic spirits. Dean dropped his bag in the small main room. The bedroom held a narrow cot, a wooden chest, and a single, unadorned cross hanging crookedly on the wall. It was all so utterly bare, so utterly final. He found himself drawn to a small, heavy oak desk tucked into an alcove beneath a window. On its surface, beneath a thick layer of dust, lay a single, peculiar item. A rolled-up chart, unlike any nautical map he'd ever seen. Its paper was thick, almost like vellum, and strangely resistant to the damp. Unfurling it carefully, Dean saw that it depicted the island, but not as it appeared on standard charts. The coastlines were exaggerated, almost distorted, and in place of depth soundings, there were intricate swirling patterns, like ancient glyphs, radiating outwards from the island's deepest point, far beneath the waves. The lines pulsed with an unsettling energy, as if drawn by a hand that understood a geography beyond human comprehension. He traced a finger over one of the strange symbols, feeling an almost imperceptible vibration beneath the paper. It wasn't just a map, it was an invocation. As he stood there, consumed by the strange diagram, a sound began to manifest. It was subtle at first, a low, resonant thrumming, barely audible beneath the sigh of the wind outside. It wasn't the house settling, nor the distant crash of waves. This sound was deeper, more fundamental, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the island, a slow, deliberate pulse that resonated in the floorboards, up through his feet and into his chest. It felt less like a sound and more like a vast, submerged heartbeat, distant yet utterly present. Dean held his breath, straining to identify it. He glanced towards the grimy window, half expecting to see some source, but the fog pressed against the pane, an impenetrable, shifting gray. He saw nothing, yet he felt something, a vast, unseen presence stirring just beyond the veil of mist and ocean. He was not alone on Blackwater. The fog, a dense, swirling shroud, became an extension of the island's oppressive silence. Dean pressed onward, his boots crunching on loose shale, the air growing colder, heavier, with each upward step. He could feel the moisture clinging to his eyelashes, tasting of salt and something else. A faint metallic tang he couldn't quite place. The path narrowed, winding through stunted, wind-battered pines that clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. He crested a small rise, the path abruptly flattening before a gnarled ancient oak. Nailed to its trunk, half obscured by moss and time, was a crude, weather-beaten sign. The wood was so decayed, the paint so faded, that only 2 words remained legible. Border checkpoint. Dean paused, a frown creasing his brow. A border checkpoint? Here? On a tiny, uninhabited island, miles from any mainland jurisdiction? He ran a gloved finger over the raised letters, the wood rough and splintered beneath his touch. He dismissed it as a remnant of his grandfather's peculiar nature, a whimsical eccentricity. He pushed past the ancient tree, the feeling of an invisible threshold crossed, settling in his gut. Minutes later, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the cottage. It stood stark against the gray sky, a squat stone structure clinging stubbornly to the cliff edge. The cottage's windows, like vacant eyes, stared out at the churning gray expanse of the sea. A sense of profound isolation washed over Dean, a wave of loneliness that was almost physical. This was it, his new beginning. He pushed open the heavy oak door, which groaned in protest, revealing an interior steeped in dust and the faint, lingering scent of damp earth and stale pipe tobacco. He spent the first few hours methodically unpacking, his movements a deliberate counterpoint to the unsettling quiet. Later, as dusk began its slow descent, painting the fog a deeper shade of bruised purple, Dean found himself drawn to a small window overlooking the jagged coastline. The tide was coming in, a relentless surge against the rocks below. But there was something off. The water seemed to rise with an unnatural swiftness, frothing higher up the crags than he remembered from the maps. He watched, fascinated and a little unnerved, as the waves battered a stretch of beach that, by all accounts, should have remained dry for another hour. He attributed it to the island's unique topography, perhaps a funneling effect, or the strong currents he'd read about in his grandfather's old nautical charts. Yet, a subtle disquiet gnawed at him. It carried with it sounds that were not quite the wind. Faint, indistinct murmurs, like voices speaking just beyond the reach of his hearing, would rise and fall. He strained to listen, but they always dissolved back into the howl of the gale, leaving him with only the impression of sound, a phantom echo. He told himself it was the sea, the wind playing tricks on the old house, on his ears, on his mind, already weary from the journey and the weight of his grief. The isolation was getting to him, he reasoned. He decided to explore the cottage properly. The place was a time capsule, filled with nautical instruments, forgotten books, and the ghost of his grandfather's presence. In a small, cramped study, dominated by a heavy, salt-stained desk, he found it. Tucked away in a bottom drawer, beneath a pile of ancient maritime almanacs, lay a leather-bound journal. The pages, thick and brittle, smelled faintly of brine and decay. He opened it carefully, the spine groaning. The handwriting was his grandfather's, familiar yet more erratic than he remembered. The initial entries were mundane observations about weather and tides, but as he flipped deeper, the tone shifted. The script became hurried, frantic. Interspersed with the text were disturbing sketches, abstract, swirling patterns that resembled ocean currents, but also something more organic, more alive. Some pages were simply filled with repeating symbols, like a madman's mantra. Then he found the warnings. Scrawled across a 2-page spread, the ink bleeding slightly from water damage, were the words, repeated over and over, underlined with furious intensity. The deep song, it calls, it waits, do not listen. Dean felt a prickle of unease spread across his scalp. The words, the frantic sketches, the deep song. It all felt like a descent into madness. He stared at the journal, at the water-damaged pages, trying to rationalize it away. His grandfather had been old, eccentric, a lonely man on an isolated island. Perhaps the solitude had finally broken him. These were the ravings of a man losing his grip. A morbid curiosity, nothing more. He closed the journal, the heavy thud echoing in the silent room. He told himself it was just the wind, just the old house, just his imagination. The words from his grandfather's journal had burrowed under Dean's skin, a cold, persistent itch. Deep song. The calling. He'd tried to dismiss them as the ramblings of a lonely old man, a mind frayed by isolation and age. But the frantic sketches, the desperate handwriting, the sheer volume of water-damaged pages, it felt too deliberate, too intense to be mere delusion. Dean ran a thumb over the warped cover, the leather cool and slightly tacky. He needed answers, a rational explanation to anchor himself against the creeping unease. His cartographer's mind, accustomed to precision and verifiable data, demanded evidence. He wouldn't succumb to phantom fears. Dean decided to delve into the island's history, hoping to find some obscure local legend, a forgotten incident that might explain his grandfather's bizarre obsession. The cottage offered little in the way of resources beyond a few tide-worn nautical charts and a dusty, leather-bound volume titled Island Lore of the Northern Reaches, printed in a faded, archaic script. He spent the next few days poring over the brittle pages of the Island Lore book, its scent of mildew and decaying paper thick in the small living room. The text was dense, filled with local dialect and obscure references, but Dean's determination was unyielding. He traced paragraphs with a finger, squinting in the dim light. He found mentions of the island's original inhabitants, a reclusive fishing community that vanished centuries ago. There were vague accounts of strange offerings left on the shore during unusually low tides, cryptic warnings about the hunger of the deep. One passage in particular snagged his attention. And the ancient pact, renewed with the turning of the sun, ensures the bounty of the waves, lest the slumbering Leviathan awaken and reclaim its due. A pact? Dean's breath hitched. He immediately retrieved his grandfather's journal, flipping through its pages with renewed purpose. His grandfather had written of a specific date, a lunar cycle, and an offering at the abyssal gate. The phrase, initially dismissed as poetic delirium, now resonated with a chilling clarity. The journal entries, once disjointed and nonsensical, began to weave a terrifying narrative of a desperate man trying to placate something vast and terrible. His grandfather hadn't been merely eccentric. He had been terrified. The air in these dreams was thick with a metallic taste, and a low, resonant thrum vibrated through his bones, a sound that felt both ancient and alive. He'd wake with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs, the taste of salt and something acrid lingering on his tongue. One morning, after a particularly unsettling dream of a city built of barnacled stone far beneath the waves, Dean rose feeling utterly drained. He shuffled into the small kitchen for coffee, his gaze unfocused. As he reached for a mug, his eyes caught on something peculiar. Tucked into the grout between the old, uneven tiles near the sink, a faint, ethereal glow pulsed. He leaned closer. It was a cluster of tiny, almost translucent growths, radiating a soft, pale blue light. Bioluminescent algae. He frowned. Algae belonged on the rocks outside, clinging to the damp crevices exposed by the tide, not inside his kitchen. He knelt, his fingers brushing against the cool, slick surface. It felt strangely soft, almost gelatinous. A prickle of unease, far sharper than anything he'd felt before, shot through him. He tried to scrape it away, but it clung stubbornly, leaving a faint, shimmering residue on his fingertip. Later that day, Dean realized he needed more historical context than the island lore book could provide. He needed official records, archived newspapers, perhaps even old maritime logs. This meant a trip to the mainland, a journey he'd been avoiding. The island, while not entirely cut off, maintained a deliberate detachment. To leave, he had to pass through the small, antiquated border checkpoint at the ferry dock. He drove his battered vehicle towards the dock, the fog rolling in again, muffling the world in a gray embrace. The checkpoint was a small, weather-beaten hut, manned by a single taciturn official who rarely looked up from his ledger. As Dean approached, he felt an unexpected wave of anxiety. It wasn't the official or the paperwork. It was the feeling of leaving the island, even temporarily. The official, a man with a perpetually damp-looking wool cap pulled low over his eyes, grunted a greeting. He stamped Dean's temporary exit permit with a heavy hand, the sound echoing in the small, cramped space. Dean glanced at the official's hands, noticing the rough, calloused skin, the faint, lingering smell of brine. The man's eyes, when they briefly met Dean's, were a flat, unreadable gray, like stones smoothed by relentless currents. Back in the cottage that evening, after a fruitless day of searching limited mainland archives, Dean found more of the glowing algae. It had spread. A faint, shimmering patch now pulsed near the base of the chimney, where the stone met the wooden floor. Another, smaller cluster clung to the underside of a forgotten windowsill. It was a slow, insidious bloom, a living light pushing its way into the dry, interior spaces of his home. He stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. The deep song wasn't just in his grandfather's journal. It was manifesting, subtly, physically, right before his eyes. And the pact, whatever it truly entailed, felt closer, more real, and far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. A tremor ran through Dean's hands as he gripped his grandfather's journal. The pages, once a jumble of cryptic scrawls, now pulsed with a chilling relevance. A pact, the ritual, the tribute. He read them aloud in the quiet cottage, the words feeling heavy, solid, like stones dropped into a deep well. His grandfather hadn't merely documented local lore. He had been immersed in it, perhaps even complicit. A shiver, not of cold, but of apprehension, traced its way up Dean's spine. He dismissed it as the house settling or the distant groan of the ocean. He moved through the small rooms, journal clutched tight. In the study, a stack of old nautical charts, meticulously rolled and tied with twine, lay scattered across the floor, as if a sudden gust of wind had swept through the sealed room. Dean knew he hadn't left them like that. He bent to collect them, his fingers brushing against the cool, brittle paper. As he straightened, a small, polished brass compass on the desk began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, its needle whirling without direction, without purpose, until it blurred into a shimmering disk. He watched it, mesmerized and horrified, until it shuddered to a halt, pointing not north, but straight at the wall. He turned to face the wall, his gaze sweeping over the old oak paneling. The hypnotic hum intensified, pressing in on him. He ran his hand over the wood, feeling for a seam, a loose knot. He pushed. With a faint click and a soft groan of aged wood, a section of the paneling swung inward, revealing a shallow, narrow recess. A bundle of brittle, blackened herbs tied with a length of rough cord. And most disturbingly, a tarnished silver locket, its surface etched with symbols that mirrored those in his grandfather's journal, interlocking spirals and jagged lines that seemed to writhe even in stillness. This was it. The evidence. Not just warding, but offerings, tributes. His grandfather had been feeding something. The hum now resonated deep within his bones, a low, guttural note that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards beneath him. He stumbled back, bumping into a tall, narrow mirror propped against the opposite wall. He caught his reflection, a pale, wide-eyed man staring back at him. But for a split second, something else was there. A ripple, like water distorting the glass, transforming his features. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, leaving only his own terrified face. He blinked, shaking his head, trying to dislodge the image. It had to be a trick of the light, the strain of his imagination. He backed away from the mirror, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The hum was a roar now, though still somehow contained, a sound of immense pressure building. He thought of the old, crumbling structure on the island's far side, a derelict concrete archway that locals called the border checkpoint, a relic from an old, forgotten dispute over fishing rights. It was a place of demarcation, a symbolic barrier. A faint, slick sheen appeared on the wooden floor, spreading from beneath the newly revealed recess. It wasn't water, not exactly. It pulsed, a slow, deliberate expansion. Dean watched, transfixed, as the liquid coalesced, rising slightly, forming a vague, shifting outline. It seemed to reach, to stretch towards him. He scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet, landing hard against the wall. The entity, if that's what it was, swelled. A silent, aqueous form rising from the floorboards, its surface shimmering with an unholy light. It was closing in, a silent, encroaching tide of pure, ancient malice. It was here. It was real. And it was awake. A pact. The ritual. The air, already thick with the scent of salt and damp stone, seemed to press in closer, amplifying the rhythmic thrum-thrum of the lighthouse beam above. He scanned the faded ink, his eyes tracing the looping script, searching for the key. His grandfather hadn't merely recorded. He had documented a process. Dean's breath hitched as he stumbled upon a sequence of dates, each followed by a single stark word: commencement, adherence, renewal. These weren't observations. These were milestones. His gaze darted to a crudely drawn map tucked between two brittle pages, depicting the lighthouse and a series of concentric circles radiating outwards into the churning sea. At the center, a symbol he recognized from other scattered notes: a jagged, downward-pointing trident. Beneath it, a line of script, almost illegible. But Dean's mind, now attuned to the journal's peculiar logic, began to unlock it. The keeper is not merely a watcher. He is the anchor. The song must be sung, the offering made, to quell the hunger. The realization hit Dean with the force of a physical blow. His grandfather hadn't been an eccentric recluse, chronicling local folklore. He had been an active participant, a guardian, a jailer. The solitary life, the relentless vigil. It wasn't just about keeping the light burning for ships. It was about keeping something else dormant. The rituals, the pact, the tribute. They were all part of a desperate generational effort to appease the entity lurking beneath the waves. The solitude he'd sought, the quiet haven, was actually the front line of an ancient, terrifying war. A low hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, not the mechanical drone of the lighthouse, but something deeper, more resonant. The air in the cottage grew heavy, dense, like breathing water. Dean pressed a hand against his temple. The hum now a dull ache behind his eyes. The words on the page seemed to shimmer, the ink blurring, then reforming into patterns that weren't letters, but swirling, hypnotic glyphs. He blinked hard, shaking his head. The effect subsided, but the sensation of a presence, a vast, patient awareness, remained. This was the deep song. He knew it. It wasn't just in the journal. It was in the very stone of the cottage, in the ceaseless roar of the ocean, trying to seep into his mind, to retune his perceptions to its abyssal frequency. He remembered a fleeting encounter at the maritime border checkpoint when he'd first arrived on the main island. The uniformed officer's questions crisp and precise, the forms neatly stacked. It had been a world of order, of clear lines and defined boundaries. Now, those lines were dissolving, the boundaries between his thoughts and something alien blurring into a terrifying, indistinct mess. He saw the officer's face for a split second, overlaid with something else. A shifting, indistinct form, like kelp swaying in murky water. Dean squeezed his eyes shut. It was just fatigue. He forced himself back to the journal, his fingers fumbling through the pages. If his grandfather had performed these rituals, there must be a place, a specific location. He found another entry, dated years after the previous ones, the handwriting more frantic, the ink bleeding slightly. The chamber, below the light. It holds the key, the tether. Do not let it weaken. The chamber below the light. Dean's gaze flickered to the heavy oak door leading to the lighthouse tower itself. He'd only ever ascended the winding stairs, never considered what lay beneath. He needed to know. He had to know. He stood, his legs stiff, the hum in his head intensifying. He descended the 3 steps to the tower's base, the scent of brine and old metal growing stronger. He ran his hands over the stone blocks, searching for a seam, a catch, anything that indicated a hidden passage. The deep song swelled, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate his very bones, making the world around him feel fluid, unstable. It was a small, almost invisible indentation in a stone block, a shallow groove that, when he pressed it, gave way with a faint click. A section of the wall, about 3 feet high, swung inwards with a groan of rusted hinges, revealing a narrow vertical shaft. The shaft led down into the very heart of the island, towards whatever lay waiting. He had found the chamber. The heavy oak door, warped by salt and time, resisted his push with a groan that echoed through the small landing. Dean braced himself, shoulder against the rough wood, and heaved. The sound of ancient hinges shrieking, a metallic lament, was deafening in the sudden stillness. He stumbled forward as the door finally gave way, revealing not a winding stair, but a gaping void. He fumbled for his lantern, its beam cutting a trembling path into the blackness. He saw a narrow, uneven stone staircase spiraling down into the earth, slick with moisture. Each step was a commitment, a descent into the unknown he had so fiercely avoided. Dean took a deep breath. the metallic tang filling his lungs, and began his slow, deliberate descent. The stairs seemed endless, the walls damp and rough beneath his fingertips. Finally, the stairs opened into a cavernous space. His lantern beam struggled against the immensity, revealing only segments of the chamber at a time. The air here was even heavier, charged with an inexplicable energy that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the soles of his boots. In the center of the vast chamber, nestled within a natural depression, lay the source of the hum. Dean's breath hitched. It was not an artifact in the conventional sense, nor a simple portal, but a living, breathing confluence of both. A massive, obsidian-like mass, roughly spherical, pulsed with a deep internal light. The light was not warm, but an icy violet glow that seemed to devour the lantern's yellow beam. It was not stone, nor metal, but something organic and utterly alien, composed of countless interwoven strands that shifted and writhed, like a colossal, dormant heart. Around this pulsating core, a series of ancient, weathered stone pillars stood, forming an incomplete circle. One pillar, taller and broader than the rest, stood slightly apart, directly opposite where Dean emerged. It had a distinct, almost gate-like quality to it, an archway without an arch, simply two massive uprights framing a shimmering, almost invisible barrier. This was the threshold. This was the border checkpoint. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to turn and flee. But a stronger, more primal urge, a morbid curiosity, compelled him forward. He stepped through the unseen barrier between the twin pillars. The moment his foot cleared the threshold, the chamber exploded into a maelstrom of sensory assault. The humming intensified into a deafening roar that vibrated not in his ears, but in his very bones. The obsidian mass at the center of the chamber flared with a blinding violet light, and the shimmering tendrils shot outwards, connecting to the surrounding pillars, forming a web of living energy. Then, the vision came. It wasn't a picture, but an experience, an overwhelming flood of images and sensations directly imprinted upon his mind. He saw the island, not as he knew it, but as a skeletal ruin. The lighthouse, his cottage, everything, corroded and twisted, encrusted with barnacles and a slimy phosphorescent growth. He saw himself, too. He was not drowning, but becoming. It wanted everything. The roar subsided to a dull thrum, the violet light dimmed, and the tendrils retracted. He was trembling, every nerve ending screaming. His hands, when he looked at them, seemed alien, the skin too pale, the veins too prominent. The metallic taste in his mouth was no longer ozone, but something coppery and bitter. He had seen it. He had felt it. And he, Dean, was not just a witness, but the next offering. The island was a staging ground, the lighthouse a beacon for its awakening, and the chamber, with its pulsating heart and the ominous border checkpoint, was the gateway to its ultimate triumph. And an icy tendril, impossibly long and impossibly cold, snaked past the doorframe. It brushed Dean's cheek, a sensation like frozen wire, and he recoiled with a gasp. The air that rushed in wasn't merely cold. It carried the stench of stagnant brine and something else. Something ancient and metallic like rusted blood. He slammed the heavy oak door shut, the resounding thud echoing the frantic beat of his own heart. He pressed his back against the rough wood, chest heaving, eyes darting around the small landing. It wasn't just out there anymore. It was actively reaching for him, probing, testing the barrier between its domain and his. He was trapped. He could feel its presence, a vast, malevolent intelligence pressing against the very fabric of his sanity. It wanted in. It wanted him. He staggered back, tripping over a loose floorboard and landed hard against the wall. His head snapped back, bumping against the plaster, and for a moment, stars swam in his vision. He pushed himself up, his hands trembling, his gaze falling upon the worn leather journal lying open on the small, dusty table. That was it. His grandfather, for all his cryptic entries and veiled warnings, had to have left something more. A way out, a defense. His fingers fumbled with the brittle pages, turning them with a desperate urgency. The elegant script, once merely perplexing, now seemed to mock his slow comprehension. He skipped over the daily observations of weather and tide, past the faded sketches of local flora. He needed something definitive, a ritual, a ward, anything that wasn't another poetic lament about the encroaching deep. The hum intensified, vibrating through the very bones of the cottage. Dust motes danced in the flickering light, swirling into indistinct shapes that seemed to coalesce at the edges of his vision. Dean. He stumbled toward the window, compelled by some instinct, some desperate need to verify the reality outside. The fog, thick and impenetrable, pressed against the glass, making the world beyond an indistinct blur. But through the swirling mist, he saw it. A stark skeletal structure, like a gate shimmering faintly. It hadn't been there before, not like this. Beyond it, the fog seemed to swirl with a more aggressive intensity, like a living thing. It was a threshold, a definitive marker. An impossible dreamlike structure that nonetheless felt utterly real. A border checkpoint. He was truly hemmed in, not just by the island's isolation, but by something far more sinister. The entity had claimed the very boundaries of his world. His gaze snapped back to the journal, his breathing shallow and ragged. His eyes scanned the final pages, filled with desperate, hurried scrawls. The ink was thicker here, almost smeared, as if written in haste or by a trembling hand. It detailed a method not of banishment, but of sealing. A temporary closure, a binding that would hold for a generation, perhaps two, before the pressure from below would build again. The conduit must be sealed, not by power, but by resonance. A life given, a path closed. The self, unbound, yet wholly bound. A severing of the link, a sacrifice of memory, of connection, of the very essence that anchors one to the surface world. To become the gatekeeper, eternally tethered, eternally forgotten by those left behind. A terrible sacrifice. Not just his life, but his self. To become eternally forgotten. To sever his connection, to become a living lock, bound to this desolate place, to this nightmare. It wasn't just death. It was an erasure, a surrender of everything that made him Dean. His memories of his lost wife, the reason he had come here seeking solace, would be gone. He would be an empty vessel, a perpetual warden against the very thing that sought to consume him. Join us. Become us. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of salt and decay. Dean looked at the journal, then at the door, then at the fog-shrouded window and the impossible border checkpoint beyond. The entity was at his heels, at his mind. This was the only way, the terrible, horrifying price. A desperate plan, indeed. But the thought of succumbing, of letting the entity fully breach, was even worse. He gripped the journal, his knuckles white, a grim, terrifying resolve hardening in his eyes. He wouldn't just die. He would fight. Even if the fight meant losing everything that remained of himself. The island was no longer simply remote. It had become an open wound. Dean felt the entity's presence as a constant, dull throb behind his eyes. A pressure that intensified with every gust of unnatural wind. Outside the cottage windows, the fog had thickened into a viscous, churning wall, swirling with impossible colors. Sickly greens, bruised purples, and a deep, abyssal black that seemed to drink the light. He watched, horrified, as the gnarled, salt-blasted trees twisted further, their branches elongating, snapping with a sound like breaking bones in the wind. The moss that clung to the rocks pulsed faintly, a bioluminescent glow that waxed and waned with the entity's unseen respiration. He'd seen a dead gull on the beach that morning, its feathers slick with an iridescent film, its eyes wide and milky, staring up at a sky that wept a fine, oily drizzle. The very ground seemed to heave, a slow, seismic shudder that vibrated through the cottage's ancient foundations. The full weight of the journal's final entry pressed down on him, a leaden cloak. He understood now. The counter-ritual wasn't merely a binding, it was a transfer. A redirection of the abyssal hunger from the island itself to a single willing vessel. And that vessel would be him. The eternally forgotten wasn't just a euphemism for death, nor even for being erased from memory. His identity, his memories, his very self, all would be subsumed, not into oblivion, but into the unfeeling mechanism of the binding, a consciousness without ego, a sentinel without a soul. His hands, calloused from years of drawing lines on paper, trembled slightly as he ran them over the aged vellum of the journal's last pages. The ink, faded to sepia, still held a terrible clarity. The counter-ritual required specific components, not for their magical properties, but for their symbolic resonance. A fragment of his deepest grief, a token of his greatest regret, and a vessel of his unshakable will. His mother's locket, still warm from his touch, a constant reminder of the loss that had driven him here. The tattered edge of an old map, a cartographic error he'd made years ago. A representation of a path not taken, a life he'd abandoned. And for his will, that would be his own heart, his own resolve, transmuted into the final act. It was the nexus, the point where the island's ancient energies converged. But between him and the towering beacon lay the oldest path, the winding track that led to what had once been the island's only point of entry for officials and supply vessels. The old border checkpoint. It was a dilapidated structure now, long abandoned, but the journal hinted at its enduring significance. Stepping outside, the wind shrieked, a choir of phantom voices tearing at his resolve. The air was a maelstrom of salt spray and something else, something cloying and biological, like the breath of a leviathan. He pushed through the churning mist, the ground squelching under his boots. The path, usually a clear line of cracked asphalt, was now choked with an impossibly dense growth of black, rope-like vines that writhed as if independently alive. The small, concrete booth, once mundane, was now utterly consumed. The vines had enveloped it entirely, forming a grotesque organic shell that pulsated with the same faint, sickly green light as the moss. The wooden barrier arm, meant to rise and fall, was shattered, its splintered fragments impaled into the ground like broken teeth. But it wasn't just the vegetation. The air around the checkpoint shimmered, an optical illusion of heat haze in the freezing wind, distorting the very fabric of space. Shapes seemed to shift at the periphery of his vision. Momentary glimpses of impossible geometry, of vast, unseeing eyes peering from the depths of the fog. He felt the entity's full force here, a concentrated psychic assault. It wasn't a voice, but a feeling of profound, ancient despair, laced with an insatiable hunger that sought to unravel his mind. The entity tried to twist them, to taint them with hopelessness, to make him believe the sacrifice was meaningless, that his grief was a weakness it could exploit. But Dean pushed back. He clutched the locket in his hand, its cold metal a grounding point. His grief was real, profound, but it was also a testament to love, a strength he would draw upon. His regret, the map fragment tucked into his pocket, was a reminder of choices, and now he was making a final, deliberate one. He stepped through the ruined barrier, past the throbbing, vine-choked booth, into the shimmering distortion. Each step was a battle, a conscious act of defiance against the crushing weight of the entity's will. He felt his self fraying at the edges, the distinction between his mind and the swirling chaos around him blurring. He knew what awaited him at the lighthouse. He knew the cost. He pushed against it, each step toward the lighthouse a defiance. The path, usually a familiar track of packed earth and resilient coastal grass, had become a slick, shifting thing, the ground itself seeming to ripple beneath his boots. A skeletal structure loomed ahead, half swallowed by the encroaching fog and the relentless spray. It was an old custom shed, long abandoned, its windows shattered like vacant eyes. But as Dean approached, it morphed. The broken walls seemed to stretch, twisting into something more deliberate, more menacing. A rusted, leaning gate, which he'd never noticed before, now barred the way, flanked by two posts that resembled misshapen, grasping fingers. The entity had manifested a final physical barrier. This was the border checkpoint. The gate, once just a decaying obstacle, now felt imbued with a malevolent sentience. He touched the cold, flaking iron, and a jolt of icy fear shot up his arm, not from static, but from something deeper, a pure, distilled terror that whispered of ancient hunger. He threw his weight against the gate. It groaned, a sound like tortured metal but held fast. The passage through felt like tearing a membrane. On the other side, the air pressed in, heavy and suffocating, as if the very atmosphere resented his presence. The lighthouse tower pierced the swirling gray, a stark silhouette against a sky that seemed to weep an endless freezing drizzle. Its beam, usually a comforting sweep across the turbulent waters, now flickered erratically, a dying gasp in the overwhelming gloom. Dean stumbled up the final incline, the wind a physical shove, trying to push his back, to keep him from his grim purpose. The door to the lighthouse stood ajar, groaning on its hinges, inviting him into the maw. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of salt, damp stone, and a cloying sweetness that made his stomach churn. The spiral staircase stretched upwards, a dizzying ascent into the unknown. As he began to climb, the light from the lantern above seemed to dim further, replaced by a pulsating greenish phosphorescence that seeped from the very stone. Each step echoed, a solitary declaration in a world that had become utterly alien. Not actual voices, but a psychic murmur, a chorus of formless thoughts that clawed at the edges of his sanity. You are alone, Dean. Always alone. And soon, you will be less than that. He clenched his jaw, forcing the words back, clinging to the fragments of the ritual etched into his grandfather's desperate hand. He reached the lantern room, the glass panes rattling in their frames. The air here was thick, almost viscous, and the source of the green light was horrifyingly clear. It wasn't a lamp. It was the entity. The temperature plummeted, and Dean's breath plumed in the frigid air. The wind howled, a hungry shriek, and the lighthouse groaned like a dying beast. He pulled out the worn, leather-bound book, its pages brittle, and found the final entry, the symbols his grandfather had painstakingly drawn. As he completed the arrangement, the entity outside pulsed, a flash of blinding green light that sent shivers through the very bones of the lighthouse. The whispers intensified, now a roaring cacophony in his mind, showing him visions of his wife and daughter, their faces contorted in silent screams, their forms dissolving into the cold, dark water. He staggered, fighting the overwhelming psychic assault, bile rising in his throat. The ritual was incomplete. His grandfather's scrawled notes blurred, then sharpened, revealing the terrible truth. The seal demanded a binding, a willing anchor. It demanded not just an offering, but a part of himself, irrevocably linked to the island, to the lighthouse, to the entity itself. He had to become the guardian, the living barrier, forever bound to this desolate rock and its terrible secret. He would never leave. He would never truly be free. His fresh start, his solitude, his very future, all would be forfeit. The entity slammed against the glass, a soundless impact that vibrated through the floor, threatening to shatter the thick panes. He had come here seeking an escape from his grief, but now he understood. There was no escape. Only a new purpose. A terrible, eternal one. He opened his eyes, determination hardening his gaze. He placed his hand flat on the central diagram, the cold stone beneath his palm. He spoke the final words, a guttural chant from the journal, his voice hoarse but steady. As the last syllable left his lips, a searing pain lanced through his hand, spreading through his arm, then his chest. It felt like tendrils of ice and fire wrapping around his heart, binding him. Outside, the impossible form of the entity recoiled, a shriek of pure, unadulterated rage that ripped through the very air, not heard, but felt deep in his marrow. The green light pulsed one last blinding time, then began to recede, drawing back into the depths, leaving behind only the turbulent gray sea and the relentless, mournful cry of the wind. Dean slumped against the cold stone wall, gasping, the pain receding to a dull, constant ache deep within him. The lighthouse beam, no longer erratic, resumed its steady, comforting sweep across the waves. The air, though still thick with brine, had lost its metallic tang. The entity was gone, sealed away for now. He was no longer just Dean, the cartographer. He was the lighthouse, and the lighthouse was him. And he would stand guard until the end of all things. Dean stood amidst the wreckage of the lighthouse lantern room, his body a hollow ache. The glass, shattered inward, lay in glittering shards, reflecting a dawn that seemed too pale, too indifferent after the night's long, terrible struggle. He didn't know how he'd done it. He'd simply pushed back the encroaching darkness, the thing that had risen from the abyssal depths, using a frantic, desperate surge of will, guided by the fragmented notes in his grandfather's logbooks and a cartographer's innate need to define, to contain. He had mapped the unmappable in his mind, drawing boundaries around the formless, and for a moment it had recoiled. It was the absence of the deep song, yet he could still feel its echo, a phantom vibration behind his eyes, a residual pressure in his skull. He was alive. The island still stood. He couldn't stay. This island was no longer a sanctuary. It was a scar, a monument to what he had faced and what he had become. He needed to get away, to put as much land, as much human noise, as much forgetting as possible between himself and the deep. The journey to the island's small, forgotten dock was a blur of exhaustion and heightened senses. The path, once familiar, now seemed to writhe beneath his feet. He saw shapes in the shifting fog, fleeting glimpses of things that shouldn't exist, barnacled forms scuttling just beyond the periphery of his vision. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, on the promise of the mainland, even as the island tried to pull his back, its ancient stones humming with a low, possessive drone. When he reached the dock, the small, battered ferry was already there, its engine sputtering a monotonous rhythm. A solitary figure, a port agent, stood beside a rickety wooden shack, the island's designated border checkpoint. The structure was less an official building and more a glorified shed, painted a peeling, faded blue, with a small window and a counter that looked like it had seen a century of harsh weather. Dean approached, each step a monumental effort, his limbs heavy, his mind a frayed wire. The port agent, a man with a ruddy face and a cap pulled low, grunted as Dean neared. "Leaving us, eh? Not many do. Even fewer come back." His voice was gruff, his eyes scanning Dean with a dispassionate gaze that nonetheless felt like an invasive probe. Dean merely nodded, his throat tight. He placed his travel papers on the counter, the crisp, official forms a stark contrast to the damp, salt-laden air and the chaos within him. The agent took them, his fingers thick, stained with what looked like engine grease. He flipped through the pages, his expression unchanging. "Purpose of visit?" the agent asked, not looking up. "Inheritance," Dean croaked, the word tasting like ash. "And now you're done with it?" The agent's eyes finally met Dean's, and for a fleeting second, Dean saw something ancient, something knowing, flicker behind the dullness. The entity wasn't just on the island. It was of the island. He had seen too much, understood too much. The island had branded him. The agent stamped the papers with a resounding thud. Right then, all clear. He slid the documents back across the counter. Don't forget us now. This island. It tends to linger. He offered a tight, humorless smile, his gaze lingering on Dean's eyes, as if searching for a familiar landmark on a newly charted, terrifying map. Dean picked up his papers, his fingers trembling. He was cleared. He was free to leave. Yet, as he turned towards the ferry, the hum behind his eyes intensified. He stepped onto the ferry, its deck vibrating beneath his feet. The agent watched him go, a still, silent sentinel at the border checkpoint. Dean didn't look back at the lighthouse, didn't look back at the island. It was within him. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the cost was his peace, his sanity. He was no longer just Dean, the cartographer. He was a vessel, a living repository of a secret too vast, too ancient, and too terrible to ever truly escape. The mainland awaited, a world oblivious, and he was walking into it, carrying the deep song within him, a silent psychological burden that would never truly lift.